All right. Oh, I've got guest muted. Let me get that guest muted thing off there, Steve. We've got Steve Snyder on. So excited to have Steve on. And I do smell something in my studio. I think it's fresh fish. Steve, first time on Halitics. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Hal. I'm happy to be here. First time guest, long time participant in discussions with you.
How are you today?
Good. It's a beautiful day, an unusually warm day, and it's a great day.
Yeah, really nice to talk to you, Steve. And I go way back. I mean, I remember I was telling Mindy, my wife, and she obviously knows you very well too, that we met. You were just a fresh-faced attorney out of law school, a couple of years maybe, and now retired. I haven't aged at all. I mean, the years haven't touched me at all, but Steve looks exactly the same as he did when he was an associate in a law firm, and moved on, of course, to becoming a assistant U.S. attorney, working for many years at the Justice Department. We'll talk about that. But, before we get to that, Steve, I mean, are you enjoying? Well, let me ask you this. When did you retire?
I retired on May 31st, 2025.
Was that the plan? Was there maybe an accelerated date because of the change in the administration, or was that irrelevant to your decision?
I wouldn't say it was irrelevant. The change in the administration wreaked a lot of havoc in my office, but fortunately, it didn't affect me directly. It affected many of my colleagues, which was very difficult to see. But I'd been thinking about it for a while, and discussions with my family and looking at things overall. Basically, I decided life is too short, and there were other things that I wanted to do.
And you mentioned to me that you're really enjoying the time off. You're glad you made this decision, I understand.
Yes, absolutely. I'm having a lot of fun.
That's great. I'm really happy for you and your family. We'll be talking maybe a little bit about Steve's family, get into some personal matters later in the program. Very fortuitous having Steve on today because there was the slaying of a woman yesterday in Minneapolis, Renee Good. And I'm going to just start with my question. We'll get into the videos, Steve, if that's okay. Let's imagine, and I think you may have faced scenarios very similar to this. Let's imagine the Internal Affairs Division of the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. came to you with a case similar to what we're seeing here, what we saw yesterday, and said, we have reviewed this, we have investigated, and we believe that this officer was not justified in shooting this woman, and therefore we are referring it to you for potential criminal prosecution.
That's not exactly how it works in DC, but, going with, how you lay it out, we would conduct our own independent investigation, and we would treat it like any other alleged crime. And, we would investigate it. We would review whatever videos we could have. We'd interview any witnesses we could get a hold of, look at officers' disciplinary records, all sorts of things, and make an assessment under the applicable law, and based on the facts that we saw, whether there is merit in going forward with a prosecution.
We're going to show some video. You mentioned video footage, something you would obviously look at when making a decision whether to seek an indictment. What are the challenges? Before we get to that, I'm just very curious about when you are looking at prosecuting a police officer. My understanding is they're going to lawyer up, to use the term we all know from Law and Order, right away. It's going to be very tough to get them to answer any questions, to surprise them, to get them, to do like the good cop, bad cop routine. You can't do all that. Also, what kind of, so maybe answer that, but also just let me throw on top of that, the legal challenges. Is it more difficult, putting aside juries' reluctance to convict officers? Do they face different standards when charged with criminal offenses?
I'll be honest with you, although I knew a lot of people who did investigate cases like this, I never personally was involved in an officer shooting case. So I don't know all of the details, but my understanding is that the question of what constitutes reasonable conduct for a police officer is often different than what constitutes reasonable conduct for a civilian. And part of the reason is that civilians do not find themselves, or flipping it around, police officers find themselves in situations that civilians just don't face. And so we have to look at the police officer's conduct, not always, but often differently than we would civilian conduct. Like in a situation like that, you're not going to find a civilian lawfully standing anywhere around a car telling a car to stop. That's just not what people on the street do, and that's not what they're authorized to do, whereas police are authorized to do that. And you have to look at the officer's conduct through that lens.
Very interesting. By the way, don't forget, click like, click subscribe. We want the interactions, any interaction with the video. You hate this video, don't just walk away. I mean, you can walk away, but first, put a thumbs down or anything, any kind of response that the computer registers benefits this program. So we please ask you to do that. Also, there it is. Click subscribe. There's the bell. And don't forget, Halitics is on Facebook as well. So lots of different ways to catch this program. We're so happy to have Steve Snyder with us. Let's go to the video tape, Steve, if that's all right with you at this point.
Absolutely.
All right. So here, I got this. I don't know who took these shots. I don't think they're from the ICE footage. ICE did video it as well, but I don't believe this is ICE footage. But here we go. This has gotten a lot of play. Maybe the same video was on the New York Times web page as well, but we'll play it from the beginning. It's a little bit of filler at the beginning, but not too much. Right, so you see the officer. I'm going to just stop for a sec. There's one of the officers approaching the car that's sort of blocking the road. There's another officer striding quickly across. The officer now who's behind, I believe, is the shooter. And I actually was wrong. You saw the shot fired. It was not the officer. It was an officer already in the picture, wasn't in the picture, was blocked by the car. And then you see it careening. The woman who was driving it was shot. And there's very bloody, there's some really bloody pictures from the interior. Steve, very gruesome. Even the president said he hated watching the video. Do you glean anything from that? I know you've seen it before, but anything you want to focus in on, or I have a slow-mo image video as well.
I've seen other videos. I've seen that one. I've seen several videos. And you mentioned that trade paper based in New York City, and I thought they put together a very good kind of side-by-side with several videos. And the first thing I gleaned from that is, one, I want to know what happened beforehand, before the woman's car was stopped in the street as the officers approached. How did she get there? What were the officers doing there? What did she see? But I've also seen the images of that officer, the officer who fired the gun, who is in front of the vehicle. And on the one hand, what I would say is that if this had occurred, maybe even now, but certainly before last January 20th, when you had all these ICE agents and National Guard all over the place, and you had what was a roadblock or a street closed off by police officers, and you had a driver who stopped, who backs up, who starts to drive away, an officer has to jump out of the way. I would be surprised if an officer fired a weapon in a situation like that. I mean, people get confused, giving the driver the benefit of the doubt. People get confused and they're not sure what to do. There's a lot going on. And officers are, by and large, my experience, are extremely reluctant to fire their weapons. And I'm not sure if I think these were ICE officers, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know what law enforcement training they have. One of my
let me just jump in. My understanding is they don't have the full run of the police academy. They haven't gone through all the training exercises. They haven't been taught to de-escalate as quickly as possible. And certainly if that's the case, you see it in the video, the officers cursing at her right away, seemed like they were escalating. I want to just play, here's the slow-mo real quick, Steve, because you can get a better feel, I think. Is it going to start? There we go. So she's backing it up. See, this was one of the, I thought, really relevant points. And please jump in any time. Some saying, well, her wheels are turned towards the officer, who you can sort of see to the right of the officer standing to the left of the car. He's kind of between the car and the officer, but she's actually backing it up. Her wheels are not turned towards them. She's backing away. And then this is, again, the slow motion. You see the officer now draw his weapon almost before she starts moving forward, it appears. And it's not, this is slow motion, so we don't get a feel for how fast it is, but let's play a little more. He's backing away and then fires into the window.
I mean, he's lucky he didn't hit his colleague, actually. I mean, given the proximity of his colleague to the window. But I watched that. And my first question is, why is that officer in front of the car? I mean, I know he was coming around, and there might have been a good reason for him to be in front of the car. But my understanding is generally officers don't like to get either in front of or behind moving or potentially moving vehicles because they can be hit. And so that might relate to his training. I saw other videos which basically saw him walking around. And as I said, I would have expected him to give the car a larger berth. All that being said, assuming the officer is legitimately in front of the car, you know, he has a legitimate law enforcement purpose to be in front of the car, in terms of prosecuting the officer, it is a tough case to prosecute him for. In the end, the car was moving towards him. Yes, her wheels were turned, but the car was moving towards him. She was not complying with police officers' directives. And looking at it from the perspective of a reasonable police officer, even though this guy was an ICE officer, but a reasonable law enforcement officer in that situation where we weren't there, he had to make a snap decision from one of a range of options. And the fact that he shot her ultimately might or might not be seen as reasonable, but on its face, just right off the bat, this doesn't strike me as something that I've seen some commentators say as a cold-blooded execution. It might have been, but it doesn't strike me as that way at all. It strikes me as much more of a situation which calls into question Trump's larger directive of sending ICE, National Guard, non-law enforcement trained individuals into these cities, into highly volatile situations. And he puts these officers in a terrible situation. And even giving everything to the officer, you know, he was concerned for his safety. He was concerned for his life. He felt like this was his only option. Even assuming that that was true, he was put in a situation, in a pressure cooker situation, where that was possible and
foreseeable. It's absolutely foreseeable that these types of situations are going to happen and people are going to get killed. And I understand this is the fifth person killed during some type of ICE raid. Let me just push back a little bit, Steve, or play devil's advocate to a degree with respect to what you were saying about the officer being in harm's way. And I understand, first of all, that even if the officer violated protocol, violated procedure by getting in front of the car, nevertheless, once they're in front of that car, if they are believe reasonably that they're at risk, then they do have the right to engage in self-defense. I question, and please explain, maybe I'm missing something, whether that was truly a self-defense shooting for this reason. The officer actually, and it's easy to say in hindsight, I think, but I would argue, put himself at greater risk by pulling that gun out and firing. When you shoot somebody who's behind the wheel of a car, that you saw the car actually sped up, she collapsed, her foot hit the accelerator, she smashed into a telephone pole. How is shooting somebody who's driving a car that you're afraid is going to hit you, how is that protecting you?
Well, yeah, it might be your only choice, might not be the ideal choice. I don't think that I would be surprised if any reviewing body would say, "Oh, well, you actually created the risk by firing your gun," because the bottom line is, if he fired the gun and she collapsed, the car drove into him, and then let's say she wasn't killed, but she was hurt, and then they decided to charge her with assault for hitting the officer with the vehicle, then you have a good argument. If you hadn't shot her, she wouldn't have collapsed. But at that moment when he pulled the trigger, his argument is going to be, listen, that car was coming in my direction. And I didn't have a protractor out there to measure the angle of the wheels, and I didn't have a forceometer or whatever they call it to see how hard she's hitting the accelerator or whatever. I had to make a decision in a fraction of a second. And my question was, am I going to see my family tonight? And I decided I'm going to see my family tonight. And he probably didn't even think about that. So I think that, I think you have an interesting point. But, just to, one other point about that, like I said, if he was technically outside of the path of travel of the vehicle by a few inches or even a foot, yeah, he might not have actually been in the way. But there's nobody, no court of law is going to say, oh, well, again, you should have had your ruler out there. Technically, it looked like the car is going to drive by you. Because, of course, she could turn her wheel towards him in any second. And she was not complying with police officers' directives. And, the Trumpers in the crowd will say there's a simple answer to the problem, which is when a police officer tells you to stop, you stop.
Yeah, that is what they would say. But, I mean, and I think this is very frustrating because there's such a partisan divide.
Right.
And if it were the other way around, as we saw on, say, January 6th, the partisan divide goes the other way, right? I mean, people seem not to be able to step back and look at this situation objectively. And I, for one, will say when I watched this and when I saw it, my first reaction was that it was a killing. I wouldn't call it an execution, but what I would say is that the officer acted recklessly with reckless disregard for human life. And if they don't, and I'm just giving you my take. I think our conversation is really interesting too, Steve, because I would posit it's similar to what prosecutors would be doing, police officers would be doing when they're discussing whether to bring charges in the first place. What was he thinking?
That's what we do every day. Well, my former colleagues and I would do every day. And, you go through it and, we all have our views and we all have our prejudices, whatever. And everybody thinks they're reasonable, whether you're far right, far left, or, stuck in the middle. Everybody thinks they're reasonable and doing the right thing. But I will say, I'm not going to say that I'm more reasonable than non-law enforcement people, but part of my training is just to look at what I see, look at the evidence, and then acknowledge to myself, I wish things were different, but I can't deny what the evidence says. And that's why I'm very careful to say, I'm not saying it was or was not a justified shooting. I'm just saying, based on what I saw,
It'd be hard to convict.
It'd be a hard case for the prosecution, but there might be more. I don't know. Again, what was he doing in front of that vehicle?
Yeah, well, and even if he acted again, I think that the defense argument to that would be, even if he made a very poor decision to get in front of that vehicle, once he was in front of it, he was reasonably in fear for his life. Right. I'm reluctant to give up my point, though, that I do question the reasonableness of firing a gun in that situation. It would seem to me, if you really are in fear for your life, you don't shoot your gun. I would argue this goes to his actual fear, whether he really was in fear, that if he were in fact in fear, he would have gotten out of the way. That would be the first thought.
Well-known doctrine in the law that you look at the behavior of the people on the scene as evidence, not determinative, but as evidence of, for example, whether or not someone is in fear. And, the fact that he fired his gun indicated that at least he believed he was in fear.
Wanted to kill somebody, or he was mad and he wanted to kill somebody.
And that might be the case. And, if you developed evidence to that effect, he had a fight with his wife or whatever, or he's, sick of these protesters and said, I'm just itching for an opportunity to do something. If you had evidence to that effect, that would certainly be powerful evidence that maybe he put himself in the situation. And that's why you really just have to investigate these much more fully. And I know the media on both sides, they get these videos and everybody forms their narrative right away. But if you care about a fair outcome, it takes a lot of investigation to recreate what took place in a matter of seconds. It can take months, if not years, of investigation.
100%. I think the best takeaway in the end is what you already provided, Steve, which is we got to question the whole wisdom of this approach and the whole the benefits and costs of deploying thousands of agents who are undertrained at best and tasked with a job that many Americans don't want them to be engaged in, or opposed to, and are doing their utmost to undermine.
Well, I think that I agree with you, but I don't believe that this administration views this as anything more than perhaps an unfortunate outcome that this person brought on. I don't think they're saying, oh my gosh, how can we stop these shootings? I think what they're saying is basically, sucks to be her. But, we're going to do what we're going to do.
I totally agree. I don't think the Trump administration is doing any soul searching whatsoever. And if anything, they view this as perhaps, I don't know what they think. I can't get into their heads. But my guess is if that officer had been the one who was taken down, they would be promoting him as a martyr. They would be saying this proves how dangerous these people are. We're going to redouble our efforts. So completely it's agree. Just an opportunity for them not, to continue doing what I think so many of us oppose.
Completely agree.
Here's a question we've got in the chat from my good friend Chip from Hody. Was the vehicle inside a defined perimeter boundary set by ICE? So I don't know the answer. I don't know if you do.
I don't know the answer. What I do know, again, looking at the video, is that the vehicle was in a place that was controlled in some way by ICE. There were government vehicles around it. And in fact, the driver's response suggests that she knew she was someplace where she wasn't supposed to be, or at least that ICE controlled. She is trying to leave. She's not just driving down the street on her way. She made, I don't know if it was a U-turn. But I don't know the answer to that specific question.
All right, let's go to the present. You mentioned the Trump administration, specifically, obviously, President Trump. Here's his Truth Social tweet, or I don't know, do we use the verb tweet to describe a Truth Social post? Is Truth Social? I don't know. Have you read this, Steve?
No, I have not. I'll read it right now.
So I kind of highlighted a few things. He writes, viciously ran over the ICE officer. I believe that's factually inaccurate. Says that the officer is recovering in the hospital. Couldn't confirm that the officer was, I would assume they were sent to some clinic, but they were walking around right in the aftermath without apparent injury. And then he uses it as an opportunity to attack the radical left. But you just were reading it. What's your reaction to this?
My reaction to this is that Trump says a lot of stuff, and obviously it's not helpful, but I think those who don't like Trump or oppose what Trump is doing, I think fall into a trap by reading things like this and wringing their hands over how insensitive and untruthful he is. I think these tweets just take time away from more productive discussions, such as why are there militaristic organizations, non-local law enforcement, patrolling American cities? And so I'm kind of beyond, getting upset about what Trump says, because all he's doing is just, saying whatever he's going to say.
And I hear that. I get what you're saying. I do think actions are far more important than words. I think what my point would be, what really I find most upsetting about this is it says to me that our country is really slipping. I mean, that we have a leader, a president who, insists repeatedly on taking the low road. I was never a fan, as you know, of George W. Bush. I think he was a very bad president. It really took Trump's invasion of kidnapping of Maduro, invasion of Venezuela, however you want to call it, for me to conclude that he is in the running with W for worst president of all time, along with several other luminaries. So I don't compare him in any way unfavorably, or at least with regard to actions, necessarily unfavorably to Bush. But Bush did show some understanding of the importance of language, the importance of trying to bring people together. And I think it says something very, very unfortunate about America today, that this president is such a divisive figure and uses every cleavage between groups that he possibly can.
Well, I agree with you, but he's what we got. And, actually, I suppose it's a whole nother discussion. Is he the best president of all time, the worst president of all time? I think he is, however you feel about him, he has been tremendously consequential in many, many ways. And history will ultimately decide whether those consequences were good, bad, or indifferent. As we live through them, it certainly seems bad. But my point is that his tut, as I like to call it, not a tweet, but a truth tut, it's not a surprise. And because it's not a surprise, it's just what he does. I think that it is much more effective just to say, yeah, whatever. I mean, the air he breathes is attention. And so the extent that you can reduce the attention that he, as the president of the United States, gets, you're depriving him of oxygen.
Yeah, as I mentioned, and I don't disagree with that. I find the divisions that he stokes very, very unfortunate. And I'm going to play a clip in a moment of the protesters in Minneapolis, who I think are also stoking division, and I'm going to be critical of them. But I did want your take really on, you said whether, how long the implications of Trump's presidency, how badly he harms America to the extent he does, the historians will have to judge. And that reminded me of something you had said before when we were talking before the program, that you're more optimistic. You don't. I take it that you are of the mind that this too shall pass. Could you explain that, if that is your mindset, and if not, where are you with respect to the ultimate implications of a Trump presidency?
Well, it is my mindset, and part of it is just my personality is generally optimistic. But in Trump 1, I used to say, he's trying to be Hitler, and I think a better description of him is that he has authoritarian impulses. But I think that the fact that we have this podcast, we're on discussing, quite frankly, and being frankly critical of the leadership of the United States, is powerful evidence that the fundamental institutions of this country remain strong. Trump is trying to bend it to his will, but our culture is very different from what Germany was. It's very different from modern countries with authoritarian regimes. And I think that, the courts have been just fantastic. And, we can say what we want about the Supreme Court, but, with that recent ruling, a Supreme Court ruling about, or I guess they declined to take the case, in which an appeals court said Trump couldn't send the National Guard into Chicago, and they followed the rule. It becomes much more troubling when the administration will openly defy definitive court rulings, particularly court rulings that aren't dealing with marginal groups. So, Trump plays games with deporting undocumented aliens and such. But in the end, he's going after marginal groups, which, of course, is what strong men do. And it's not to say that, I'm any more sanguine because he's going after them. But I think that given the overall, the culture that we have in the United States, and the guardrails put up by the courts, and the fact that people are continuing and perhaps even increasingly fighting what the administration is doing, it gives me confidence that we will, in the end, survive this, and the country will look very different in some ways, and it'll look, I think, very similar in most ways to the way it always has been.
Phone number here if you want to join us, 240-242-5646. Love to take your call, 240-242-5646. Do you see Trump as a break qualitatively from previous presidents, whether we're talking about policy or rhetoric? And I do see that, but I mentioned the break that I see. His rhetoric really is more divisive than we've seen from previous presidents. Do you think in terms of the policies, he really represents more of a continuation of, I don't know, go back to the Reagan, Bush, Clinton. I mean, there's different presidents, different parties, but, we can see certain trends that have continued over that period. Do you think he's a decisive break, or do you think he is just, someone that kind of following the same trajectory in terms of policy?
I think that's actually a really good question. And the short answer, which, is not exactly broadcast material, is I don't really know. I think that, Trump's views were formed in the 1980s. And many of his policies really resemble a lot of what was being done in the 1980s. And I think for most people, if all we were dealing were policy changes, Trump would be easier to swallow. The problem for him is, as you highlight, the divisive nature, the crude rhetoric. He's done some things that have been truly, I think, really harmful, not only to the American public, but to the world public, such as the decimation of certain sections of the federal government, the use of the military almost as an instrument to just impose Trump's will wherever he happens to form an opinion. But, in terms of his now interventionist foreign policy, that's pretty 1980s. His attempts to control certain industries, that's not 1980s. I mean, that's never really been done in this country in the same way. I mean, that's something that, far left individuals might dream of doing, but they never had the political power or will to do it. And Trump's like, hey, Intel, give me a tribute or else we're going to cut off government business from you. Trump is very effective at using power. He's very skilled at using power, and he's utterly shameless. He's utterly amoral, and he's totally transactional. And so, if something comes up that gets his attention, then he might even change a view because, he decides it's in his interest. It makes it very hard to predict with any confidence what he's going to do.
Well, it's a good point because he's really doesn't seem to be necessarily driven by ideology because you see him make, 180-degree turns. It's hard to know where he stands. He seems to, have his new buddy is Zoran Mamdani. So and to me, this really does point out a terrible mistake that Democrats made. I think they made it for political reasons. I think it was determined that for their own in their own interests, they should be confronting Trump at every opportunity. They should be demonizing Trump. I think that was a big mistake, Steve. I said back in 2016 after the election, they should try to make nice with him, compliment him. Tell him what, smart campaign. He's so smart. You were so smart to the way you turned that on, and you want to bring jobs back to America. So do we. And they went in a different direction. And I think that was also a big mistake.
Well, I think that, there are kind of two halves of that question. One half is how do you work or not work with Trump and further your own agenda? The other half is how do you further your political interests? And Democrats are still making that mistake in terms of running against Trump. People need a positive reason to vote for you. They need more than just, you're not the guy we hate. And one thing that I have to say Democrats are doing really well is, just you step back for 30 seconds. One of the reasons that the Republicans are where they are, particularly with Trump, is that they made a decision, and I watched this at the time. They made a decision in the 1980s that we're going to look at things for the long haul. And maybe because they had this, religious component where, they view things in epochal terms. And so they're not just trying to get the best result for today or tomorrow. They're looking at things in the long term. But the Republicans, they are really concentrated on winning state races. They beefed up the Federalist Society. It was no longer a bunch of eggheads, but it became a breeding ground for Republican leaders. And their efforts have have delivered results for them. And the Democrats have finally woken up, and they're starting to do this. And I've read a number of articles where on the state level, Democrats are really putting effort and money into state races. And that's the way you ultimately gain power. It's not as fun as having a big defeat. It's not as fun as 2020 was, that great day when Biden was declared the winner. But what we saw was after 2020, the divisions more or less remained. They didn't change a whole lot. And part of the reason is that out in the hinterlands, people still felt the way they felt. Whereas if you concentrate in the states, which are not only the laboratory for democracy, but they're the breeding ground of representatives and senators and presidents. And it's a long-term project. Not nearly as fun and satisfying, but it pays dividends. And the Democrats have finally woken up and they're starting to do that. And I hope they continue to do that.
Yeah, well, we agree. Although I think one area where maybe we don't see it exactly the same, I'll push back a little bit. I think it's really important you have to concentrate. Obviously, you have to have resource management. You have to decide what races you can win. But I also think the Democratic Party, at least it's not perceived, and I think pretty fairly, as standing for anything. You need to have a brand. You need to be known as the party for workers or the party for peace or the party for something, but they aren't. And that's given the Republicans this huge opening to say, oh no, we're the party of labor. And the tariffs are a perfect example of that, of how we are. And I'm not a Democrat. Honestly, I'm not. I'm not a registered Democrat. But if I were, I wouldn't have an answer to that.
Well, but look, the out of power party rarely stands for something because they don't have a clearly defined leader. And that's always been the case. I mean, for a long time, and even now, quite frankly, what's the Republican song? Lower taxes, less regulation. All right, fine. They stand for that. But if, you're some farmer or factory worker or computer programmer in, rural Virginia, Boston, Austin, or whatever, how do fewer regulations and lower taxes necessarily help you? But when you get a leader, then all of a sudden that leader defines the party. And so I agree with you. It's great if the Democrats stand for something, but there is no singular leader of the Democratic Party. So there's no one to get up there and say, this is our brand. Because Hakeem Jeffries can say one thing, and Chuck Schumer can say something else, and Wes Moore can say a third thing, and Gavin Newsom says something else. And until those Democrats slug it out and one of them emerges on the top, there won't be a leader. And so without the leader, the party doesn't stand for a whole lot other than hopefully healthcare.
Yeah, I don't think Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, Wes Moore, or Gavin Newsom really are that far apart. I mean, they all sort of seem to stand for kind of the same thing to me. And even when they're, Democrats have been in power, I don't really know. For example, it's easy to say Joe Biden, what he stood for, but even going back to Clinton and Obama, it doesn't seem to me that their presidencies were defined by any specific ideological cast or ideological goal, the way you could say FDR's was or Lyndon Baines Johnson's was. They kind of took the situations as they came, but I don't think there was really an Obama doctrine, for example, or a Clinton doctrine.
Well, Obama did pass the Affordable Care Act, arguably one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in the last 100 years. So, that's something, and, he stood for health care. And one of the reasons that the Republicans have been unable to kill it, despite numerous attempts, is, quite frankly, it's popular. With all its problems, it's still popular. So they, if Obama, I'm sure if you were to ask him, I haven't spoken with him, but I bet you if you were to ask him, what is one legacy you want, he'd be pretty satisfied if it was the ACA.
All right, 240-242-5646 if you want to join us. I did promise another clip, Steve. So we talked about the problematic nature of Trump's Truth Social posts and his consistent efforts is often very successful to divide Americans. What do you think about this protest? Let me play. This is a clip here. The streets of Minneapolis right now, actually, or this was an hour or two ago, but I think it reflects the reality on the ground at this moment as well.
Protest.
So very, very angry crowd, very raucous crowd, really getting after these officers on the ground. I'm going to skip forward a little bit because we don't need to play all of it, but I also just want to focus on the way the officers react, or at least one of them did. Now, a lot of these are police. They're not necessarily ICE. I'm not sure which are which, but just to continue.
I just followed orders to that. Fuck up. Why don't you tell these people to back the fuck up? Yeah, okay, then back up. Dave, no, we don't have to. Yes, you do. How many times? Just shoot all of us?
I don't think you could catch it, but in the video, the officer also drops an F-bomb there and really responds, gets into it with the crowd. Not what we want to see, Steve.
Well, look, officers are people too. And I've heard many an F-bomb dropped by law enforcement officers, and I've been known to have a few fall out of my mouth as well. If that's the worst that happened, I wouldn't be too upset. But I see this, and my first thought is, this is an opportunity. You got a lot of people who are upset. And I'm not a politician. I'm not in that world. But it seems to me that if you are a savvy politician, you got to be looking at that and asking yourself, how can I harness that energy? The same way that, you had the No Kings protest last summer. A lot of energy out there, a lot of people. Another reason I'm optimistic, by the way. The same way in 2010, when you had the rise of the Tea Party. And you can discuss however much you want about, the underlying basis for it, but there were a lot of Republicans were out there in the hinterlands, and they said, "Hey, this is something I can use." And so, you and I were talking before the show. I think it's counterproductive for demonstrators to get in police face, and violence is never justified, and all of that. Completely agree. But look, the protesters are out there. The people are upset. And I think if you are a leader, and in this case, if I were some Minnesota council member or however they refer to their local officials, I'd be really putting on my thinking cap and trying to figure out a way I can work with these people and utilize them to harness that energy to affect some change, rather than just either complaining about ICE or complaining that these protesters are intimidating or getting violent.
100%. You have to present a vision for a better Minnesota, and you have to present it consistent with the anger that people have with these armed thugs, goons, whatever you want to call them. We've heard that term. You would not use those terms, but I would. That we're seeing. Maybe you would. I don't know. Shouldn't put words in your mouth. But notwithstanding what the officer who pulled the trigger there might have a sufficient legal defense. We agree this is not the way we should be addressing the immigration problems that we face in this country. And I agree, politicians would be wise to try to figure out how to harness the energy. I have a problem on the left because I think that those kind of videos show activists choosing the wrong, quote, enemy, fighting the wrong enemy. I don't believe it is the police. I don't think it is, some of these officers, yeah, you have rogue officers, you have people who do bad things. They're ultimately really just tools of the plutocrats, the people in charge. And that's the ones we should try to be, we should be focusing on. I remember one thing, Steve, I know I'm talking a little bit more than I have been, but I just want to point out something that I remember when I was at Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street 14 years ago. And when we were marching and there was a wall of blue on either side of us, the police, and we would chant at them, "We are the 99%." And then we would point at the blue shirts and say, "You are the 99%." And, tell hey, blue shirts, you should be with us, and try to break them off from the white shirts, the lieutenants and the captains, et cetera. I think that's the way you can make real political change.
I agree with you that, these law enforcement officers, by and large, are just out there. They're doing their job. I have heard about a number of them that they don't particularly like it. It's not what they're trained to do. It's not what they signed up to do, although that was more the National Guard. But, they're just a bunch of guys, hoping they don't get killed before the end of the shift.
Right. They have much more in common with everyday Americans who are very, very upset with this circumstance, and also some who support it. And I think when you do that, when you get in their face, you also alienate those who you might be able to reach, and you solidify the opinions of those who are, constitutionally different politically than you are. Anything else you want to add? I do want to move. I billboarded. We were going to talk a little bit about personal stuff, family matters, and I want to get there, but I also don't want to prevent you from making a final word or two about what we've been discussing so far.
I think we've explored this issue quite fully.
All right, about 14 minutes left in Halitics. Again, if you want to join us, 240-242-5646. It's great to have Steve on. Steve, you have a transgender son.
That's correct.
How does that, I don't even know where to go with this question. What are the challenges that you face and you think people should know that you and your wife face in this situation?
Well, our personal challenges are just supporting our kid as best we can. Our son, obviously, born a female, but never was a girly girl and liked wearing boys' clothes and having a short haircut from a very early age, tended to hang out with boys. One of the things that was most interesting to us is that as he entered puberty, we never gave him puberty blockers. So he had all the girl hormones and stuff. He never displayed what I had heard from friends was very common behavior for pubescent girls, which is, being very emotional, being very volatile. Never like that. His behavior is always much more like a boy, and he's been an easy kid, and he's always been an easy kid, and he was known in our neighborhood as the happiest kid on the block because he was and remains just a very happy kid. But he had this conflict within him. And so what we did throughout was just followed his lead, as I think any good parent does. You try to guide your child, but you follow their lead. I mean, it's their life, not yours. Before Trump came in terms of getting different types of medical care and such, there wasn't an issue. And fortunately, we live in a state that that has not blocked trans care. And so we've been able to get all the care we needed. But then we have this second issue of all the externalities. And my son is very aware of what's going on in the world. And he reads the paper every day. And he's aware of all these attacks on trans kids and the demonization of trans people. And, but, fortunately, he's a teenager who is largely focused on himself. And so even though he knows about it, it's all in the outside world. But I think, to answer your question, the biggest challenge we've had is finding opportunities to say to people, you've never sat at the kitchen table. You've never had to make the decisions that we make. You have ideas about what it's like, but at least in my life, this is the most unique experience I've ever had. Nothing prepared me for it. I know of no analog. I think even having a child who comes out as gay or lesbian, it's not the same. Some similarities, but it's not the same. And for those without this experience to opine on the care that we should be able to provide and how we raise our child is just incredibly infuriating.
Do you ever find yourself, and actually before I ask this question, I want to clarify something. I asked Steve what were the challenges he faces, and I'm centering Steve. I'm not centering his son, but that's because I'm talking to you. I mean, if your son were on the call, then I would be asking him the challenges he faces. It's not that I'm reducing or minimizing. Obviously, the person who's most impacted by the realization that they're transgender is that individual, not their parents. But parent has a great, obviously is very much impacted as well. You love your son, you want them to be happy, and you do what you can under those circumstances. So that's why we're really talking about you first. Steve, do you ever find yourself, here's the question I was thinking about, arguing with the old Steve, right? The Steve before your son announced that he was transgender. Do you ever find yourself thinking, gee, that's not what I used to believe. My views have changed.
No, because before I knew about transgenderism, I didn't think about it at all. So I didn't have a view. I do remember I had a view, and this was probably 15 years or so ago, when there was a discussion about whether or not gay marriage should be legal. And for a moment, I remember talking to my wife and saying, well, I don't know. Society has to set up standards. And so, we need to set up rules. And then my wife, who is much more practical than I am, just asked, what do you care? And it really struck me. It's like, what do I care? And then, as I learned more about it, and of course, with sexual orientation, it's not something that's a choice. So, that kind of ends the discussion. But the same with being trans. It's not a choice. I mean, my son and I have discussed this many times. And he's very open. He's like, I don't want to be this way. And I say, I don't want you to be this way, But, it's, but that's where we are. You play the hand you're dealt. And so.
Well, and let me just interrupt for a second, because that brought something to my mind, which is all of us have, I think all of us, I certainly do have many aspects that I wish that weren't me, right? I mean, I'm not thrilled with every part of Hal by any means. So the fact that your son isn't thrilled with the fact that he, is physiologically a female, well, okay, that's a challenge that he has to face. And obviously it's a big one. I'm not saying it's not diminishing it, but, we all have parts, things in our lives and aspects of ourselves that we're not happy about.
Well, I think, you're making a really good point. And one, he is dealing with it, by transitioning to live the way he's comfortable. So, the same way that someone who has a quick temper deals with having a quick temper by trying to control themselves, maybe getting therapy or something like that. You don't just sit there and suffer in silence. You do something. And I'm not aware of anything in the world that, part of the frustration is that if you, for example, have depression, crippling or otherwise, you get medication for it. No one stops you. It's like, of course, you're depressed, get medication. Yet, if you have gender dysphoria, which is the origin of being trans, no, you're not allowed to get medication for that. And it's like many things where, people talk about it in theory, but, when they deal with it, it's very different. And gender dysphoria is different, like I said, than having a quick temper or being rigid or not speaking up when you're people cut in line in front of you. Those are personality traits that you'd like to modify. This goes to the core of how you view yourself, and it's the emotional blood vessel system that goes throughout your body. And so how could you change some of those emotional blood vessels? You can't. It's just how you think of yourself. And
it's interesting, Steve. I just want to jump in because we're kind of running short a little bit.
Sure.
It's interesting to me that your son, from an early age, it wasn't like at adolescence. It was from a very early age, as I understand it, that he was displaying traits that would be considered, I guess, boyish, more masculine, whatever term. I've heard, studies have shown that the number of trans boys has risen significantly, has risen much more quickly, trans boys than trans girls. In the past, there were more trans girls, trans women than trans boys, trans men. Now it's maybe the other way around. One explanation I've heard is that it's really, really tough to be a girl these days, and boys have it better in some ways. It's tough to be a boy too. I'm just an explanation. That's irrelevant, obviously, to this situation, because your son didn't decide at 13, oh my God, it's awful. There are all these body shaming of girls and women on social media, so I'd rather be a boy. That wasn't part of this.
I totally reject that. This idea that, it's a fad, it's something you do as a teenager. Nobody in their right mind would choose to live this, even before Trump came in. Just nobody in their right mind would, whether you come to it at the age of 2, whether you come to it at the age of 20 or 60, just nobody would. And that perspective views it through the lens of the viewer who does not suffer from gender dysphoria. And you can talk about edge cases. Some people do regret transitioning and transition back. Some people, I don't know, maybe some people do it as a fad. I have no idea. But by and large, and especially now where it's so difficult to think that anybody would do it voluntarily, I think the converse is much more likely, which is that young people or not so young people have these feelings and they're not acting on it because they are concerned about the impact it will have on their lives, and because of the negative the negative view that society has. And the bottom line of it is there are so few trans people, and for these politicians who are doing this as a total political stunt, because like we have a neighbor who's a solid Trumper through and through, loves him. Oh my God, does our neighbor love him? Loves everything about him. His poop doesn't stink. Everything is perfect. But you know what? She is incredibly respectful of my son, and she makes efforts. Like she had to come over to our house once. She wanted to make sure what he calls himself by. Incredibly respectful. And that's my understanding of how most people are one-on-one. Even if they don't understand it, even if they don't like it, they respect people's right to live their lives. And that's ultimately what we want. Just leave us alone. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to understand it. I don't even understand it. But just let us live our lives.
All right, let me center myself. I have been accused of being transphobic. And there are two areas where I understand why people call me that. I want to address those. One, and let's start with the first, I don't know which is easier. I oppose trans girls competing on competitive girls teams. I just don't think that's appropriate. I think that there are physiological differences between males and females. I understand there's some people, there's XXY, and there are people who have developmental sexual differences, but they're the very, very marginal cases that we can deal with. Other than that, I think girls' sports should be for those who are conceived, girls, females. Is that, in your view, is that a transphobic argument? Is there something wrong with, or a transphobic position? Is there something wrong with that position?
Well, I think that argument falls into a trap that you were discussing earlier in connection with other issues with Trump, which is it politicizes an issue that shouldn't be politicized. And whether it's transphobic or not, I mean, I don't like to apply labels. I don't know. I think I tend to agree with you. You know, the level at which you draw the line, I don't know. Is it high school? Is it college? You know, is it club sports? I don't know. But again, there are a tiny number of trans people. There are an even much smaller number of trans girls trying to participate in female sports. And the NCAA and other organizations had figured out a way to deal with it. I don't even know what their rule was. But again, like, people are just so worried. And how many are there? Is it one? Is it two? Is it 20 out of a country of 350 million people? And that's something that the president of the United States is getting worked up about. It's just, to me, it is absolutely nuts to even have the discussion, even though I tend to agree with you. You know, if you have a biological advantage like that, it does seem unfair. But it's like,
what about,
worrying about
I'm sorry.
this. No, I'm just saying, why are we worrying about it?
I mean, if you're gonna, if you're asking that not rhetorically, I mean, I think it's not common. It's very, very uncommon. But if you have you're from a working class background and your daughter is a solid athlete, and the coach is saying, yeah, they have a chance to get a scholarship at a D1 school. There's only a limited number. If you see one or two of those scholarships going to somebody who's you view as biologically male, you're going to be upset about that.
Well, like I said, I agree with you on the issue. I think if you have that biological advantage, it is unfair. I don't really care either way. If they ban trans kids from high-level sports, that's fine. It's not going to impact too many people either way. And I get the fairness argument. I totally get it.
What about this? And it's interesting because you mentioned that your son did not have hormone treatment. I don't know whether there were other physiological changes that they're requesting or they're getting at this point. I'm not saying I oppose treatment for minors. I just find it to be troubling that you could change, whether you go through puberty or when you go through puberty. That seems to me a very, very significant decision. I'm not saying it shouldn't be the parents and the child's in consultation with the parents. Help me how you struggle with that, if you have struggled with that, or with other types of surgery, surgery that would alter your genitalia.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to discuss the medical treatment, if any, that my son has received. But as a general matter, it's hard. It is hard. And I do know that you can't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm trans. I want to have my genitalia altered, and I want to have different hormones. It requires consultation with accredited medical professionals, a lot of discussion. It requires therapy. It involves a lot of thought, a lot of agonizing. And we can all be troubled. But how, I just come back again to the question. Until you're sitting at that dining room table or that kitchen table, you really just don't know. And the question ultimately becomes, what do we do? What do we do? We're there. We have this issue. We've tried everything else. My wife and I are lucky in that, we have generally a happy, well-adjusted kid, despite of all this. But particularly if you have a kid who's showing tremendous signs of distress, and it is, to my mind, this is much more akin to any other aspect of parenting, even though the ramifications are seemingly longer lasting, which is you do the best you can, consulting with knowledgeable professionals, and you make your best decision. And if there's a parent out there whose every decision was perfect for their kid, I haven't seen them. But I know many people who are suffering long-term psychological consequences because of decisions their parents made in good faith when they were young. And they are suffering for their whole lives. And so, our general rule is, within the range, parents are allowed to make decisions for and with their children. So you raise a good point, but until you've sat at the table, you just can't know. And that's why you have to trust the people who have the greatest interest in the child's health, which are the parents and the child and the doctors that they work with.
See, I really appreciate your, being so honest and really sharing a personal, very personal aspect of your life. I think it's very valuable. I hope people take to heart what you just said about the importance of letting people who are living that experience make the decisions that will govern their lives. I mean, I don't think that's even arguable.
And I just want to add,
I wouldn't even try.
We allow parents to homeschool their children, even though many people think it's a poor decision. We allow parents to bring in a nanny, even though a lot of people say it's much healthier for a child to go to daycare and get socialization and develop immunity to various childhood diseases. We allow parents to make all sorts of decisions. We allow parents to bring their children up in a religion that many view as hateful or worse. But that's part of what we do. We don't tell parents how to raise their children. So I view raising trans kids as much more, it's just on the continuum of what we have to deal with as parents. I mean, I have a relative with an autistic child, and I take my situation every day of the week and twice on Sunday. They have real challenges.
All right. Well, you kind of pushed me to ask you this question then, because I don't disagree with what you just said when it comes to parents who are doing the best they possibly can to come up with the right decision in concert with and deferring as appropriately to their child. But what about the flip side, where you have parents, you mentioned religious, people who are biased by their own upbringing, by their own community, against the whole idea that there's even such a thing as transgenderism, and point blank refuse to allow their child to have any kind of gender affirming care, not just hormone treatment, not just some type of surgery, but just won't even let them talk to a therapist. What then should the state, if anything, do?
I think that's very sad, but that's their right. And hopefully the kid will make it to 18. And then when the kid's 18, the now young adult will be free to pursue whatever treatment they want. I mean, popular culture is legion with examples of where parents are passionately opposed to something until their kid displays it, and then all of a sudden they change. Sometimes the parents don't. And, one of the hardest aspects of life is letting people make decisions that you disagree with. But that's part of what being in a free society is, or really in any society.
All right, well, we aren't going to talk about Venezuela, but I'll throw it in there. Making decisions that letting them make decisions that they're making that you don't like. Well, obviously Trump and Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller aren't prepared to let the people of Venezuela or the leaders of Venezuela make decisions that they don't like. And I think that's obviously a big problem. But, we'll save that for another day, Steve. Thank you so much for joining me. What a great hour for me it was. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Hal. I really appreciate it.
All right. And I'll be back tomorrow for the free-for-all. Thanks to all of you for being part of Halitics.